Thanks, everyone. My name is Jack Sanker. I'm a partner here at the firm, also on the construction group. And today I'm going to be talking to you about PFAS, which is a chemical compound that you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next couple of years, and how it affects the construction industry. I'll do my best not to bore everyone with the kind of science of it all. And frankly, if you ask me too many questions about that part of it, I won't be able to tell you anyways. But I can tell you how it is affecting companies already and how it's likely going to affect specifically folks in the construction industry over the next 45 minutes or so. So we'll start with, okay, what is PFAS? You probably all have heard or have read something about what are commonly called forever chemicals, things that get into the environment and frankly never go away. They don't biodegrade. PFAS is one of those things. PFAS is a quote-unquote forever chemical. So what it means is when it gets into the environment, it sticks around. Where does it come from? What type of industrial products and things like that are you finding PFAS? Pretty much in everything, and that's what makes this so challenging. Getting back into the science, there's two main types of PFAS. There's perfluorooctanoic acids and perfluorooctane sulfonates. And these are the two main types of PFAS chemicals. And these are the things that you'll see on some of the ingredient labels or like on the side of a paint can or things like that. You may have these like more technical terms that may not say like quote unquote PFAS. But those are the two most common types, and they are found in a lot of things, frankly. Food wrappers, pesticides, fire control, foam, and things like that. I put some items over here. Non-stick cookware, anything that is non-stick or stain-proof or stain-resistant, that's a huge red flag, usually because of the natural chemical elements of the way that PFAS actually works. It's usually going to include PFAS, or it often can. So water repellent, things like that, and it's in a lot of paints, sealants, specifically for our industry, any type of sealant, both indoors and outdoors, you're going to see a lot of PFAS inside of it. So yes, in the construction industry, that's like roofing, coatings, floorings, glass, fabrics, and so on. It's extremely common. You've probably also heard of the word microplastics. This is not the same thing as microplastics. PFAS are not microplastics. However, microplastics, if those of you have ever read about these things or heard about it on the news or whatever, microplastics often contain PFAS. So these kind of like three hot topic environmental, let's say, buzz phrases that are kind of going around a lot these days. Microplastics, PFAS, and forever chemicals, they're all very closely related for our purposes. What is the problem with PFAS? Why do we care about it? Why is it something that's even being regulated? Why am I talking to you about it? Well, one of the reasons is, as I mentioned before, it doesn't go away. Once it gets into the environment, in the soil, as well as in the groundwater, things like that, it mostly sticks around forever. It's water soluble, it's colorless, odorless, tasteless, so you don't know if indeed you are consuming it. And I'll get to it on the next slide, but it's linked to a ton of health risks, and that's why all of a sudden states and the various federal agencies are extremely interested in regulating it. And that's also going to lead to a lot of the risk exposure that we're going to talk about later, is the inherent health risks that are so closely correlated to PFAS exposure. Exposure itself, how does it actually happen? Most often it's drinking water. It's something that folks are just consuming throughout their normal day. Of course, it's being used when you cook. If you take a shower and there's steam and you breathe in the steam, that can also expose you to it. I mean, it's like I said, it's extremely, extremely common, and it's. I'll show you some statistics in a moment about how common exposure is. That when I was first doing this research a couple years ago, was a little shocking for me. Some other aspects that are unfortunate, but again highlight why this is so important is you get exposed to it a number of different ways. As I mentioned, drinking is the drinking water is the most common, but 100 other ways. But then it also transfers to infants and to fetuses in utero. So there are increasingly more and more folks that are being born with high levels of PFAS already in their bloodstream as newborns. So this is a public health crisis, and it's something that is drawing a lot of regulatory attention, as you can imagine. Excuse me here. All right. Hope that's better for everyone. So what's so bad about PFAS? Yes, it's showing up in people's bloodstream. Why is that a big deal? You'll see up here. Now, a lot of these are not, one for one proven. There are some that are like pretty well substantiated to be caused or at least exacerbated by PFAS exposure, and there are many more that are just strongly correlated with it or sort of arise at the same time as someone who is exposed to PFAS. But as you can see, they're all pretty serious. Developing effects in unborn children, like you're seeing more and more of that, and a lot of it which can be blamed on PFAS exposure, which is obviously very sad. Of course, things like lower birth rate. There's all sorts of things in adults, of course, obesity, fertility issues. A lot of different types of cancers have been shown to be strongly correlated to PFAS exposure. Liver damage, thyroid disease, cholesterol levels, like you name it. Quite a lot have been linked to these things. And if it's not a direct one-for-one cause, the correlation is strong enough that regulatory agencies, not only in the U.S., but in Europe and Asia, are also taking action on this stuff. So it's something that we're all starting to think about all of a sudden and worry about. So why does this matter to you all? Why does this matter to me? Why are we talking about it during a construction seminar? I mentioned that I would kind of throw a statistic out here that when I learned it kind of, shocked me. Blood tests that have been done on American citizens when they were initially figuring out that PFAS was invasive to human beings and was all over the environment. The blood tests that were done, they were initially being done at 3M, the big manufacturing and petrochemical company, on the factory workers. And the concern was that the factory workers were being exposed to these chemicals and would have higher levels of PFAS. So they would take samples from the factory workers and then compare them to randomized samples from the general public. The problem was with the way that those studies were set up is that there was no distinction between members of the generalized public and members and factory workers from 3M who were like working with these chemicals every day. So they thought that the tests were defective. They weren't being done correctly. No. Turns out that the average American citizen who doesn't work at 3M, that's just living their life, has the same level of PFAS in their bloodstream as a factory worker who's handling it every day. That's because 97% of all Americans, according to the blood tests that have been done, and this is all pretty accurate, already have PFAS in their bloodstream. So everyone here, right? And to varying levels and to varying degrees, but it's already happened. There's a lot of other interesting and unfortunate data that's been shown to come out of this. For instance, I forget the specific term, but it's something along the lines of genetic loading. Forgive me, I don't remember the exact term, but what will happen is individuals, pregnant mothers in particular, will be tested and will have the amount of PFAS in their bloodstream measured, and then shortly after they give birth, that level will drop. And for a while, we didn't quite know why that was. Turns out it's because that the PFAS in the bloodstream of the mother has been transferred into the infant baby. So that's one way that you're seeing this type of thing get into newborns and things like that. So sorry to be a bummer, but this is why we're talking about it. all that said, if you like fell asleep for the first 10 minutes of me talking and you fall asleep for the next 25 minutes of me talking, and you like remember, one thing from this discussion, I would say that this is probably it, is that PFAS, you can like in your mind just think of it kind of the same way that you would think of asbestos. Not that you have to do the same things as asbestos, but approaching it broadly the same way. It's going to be very heavily regulated. It's going to lead to a lot of class action lawsuits. It's going to lead to a ton of private litigation. It's going to change the way that we do construction work. It's going to change the way that certain trades get certified and things like that. So this is like the biggest takeaway that I can give everyone today. PFAS is the new asbestos. The good news is, folks like us that are in the industry have been dealing with asbestos and lots of other chemicals and lots of other toxic substances effectively. It's a pain in the butt, and we don't love doing it, but it doesn't have to stop things, and it doesn't have to be an insurmountable hurdle for the work that we do. So the good news here is that the construction industry is already well equipped to deal with harmful, toxic, dangerous substances that are found in construction materials or building materials and things like that. This is just a new one to worry about. Of course, it's like I said, it's a pain in the butt, but we already do this. So that is, kind of the silver lining here. I won't bore you all with some of the new federal regulations on reporting, but this is something that, especially if you're an executive or in a role at your company where you're going to be talking about these types of things, regulatory compliance, things like that, you ought to be looking at pretty closely. This is new regulations, reporting requirements by the EPA, which so far have been challenged under the new administration, and there's been a couple of lawsuits that have been filed under for example, the rulemaking authority case, the overturning of Chevron, things like that. So far, these regulations have all withstood the courts and the renewed scrutiny on them, so they seem to be sticking. And I would not, feel safe banking on some type of judicial bailout that's going to say, never mind, these don't go into effect. So retroactively, going back to 2011 now, companies, businesses in America that produce, import, manufacture, or even sell or place into the stream of commerce, it depends on, kind of what it is that you're doing. Any PFAS material or item that contains PFAS, things like that, is going to have to report that, like I said, retroactively, going back to 2011, to the EPA. Many companies don't realize that they are impacted by this because, especially manufacturers or sellers or importers, you're not checking on what chemicals may or may not be used in the widget that you're buying from overseas to, introduce into your manufacturing process or include in whatever it is that you ultimately sell. It's really not something you used to have to worry about, but now you kind of do. So if you're not thinking about this, it would be a good time to either look into the rules yourself, if you have general counsel, make them do it, or reach out to us, because this is something that we're doing for businesses and making sure that they are compliant with this reporting aspect, and if they're not, could put themselves in a rough spot with the EPA. A lot of these reporting requirements are, at the federal level, are arising under the TCSA, the Toxic Substance Controls Act. This has been around for a long time. The new rule just includes PFAS in the reporting requirements. And this is going to extend to not only manufacturers and importers, but also, like I said, folks that are introducing components that contain PFAS into the stream of commerce, which could mean retailers, could also mean couriers or transporters. There's some resources for this. I don't have them up here, but we could talk about it offline. Or if you want to shoot me a message about like, how do I know what contains PFAS? Like how do I know this thing that I am buying from overseas or I'm creating in my factory or this chemical that I'm using in my processes contains PFAS? Like, where would I even figure that out? There are public resources available that will list, either common components or chemicals, industrial chemicals that contain PFAS, or just products themselves that do. So you can consult those things and to kind of cross-reference that with what you're doing to figure out if you're being exposed to these new regulations. And I would suggest that those of you that are sitting here worried right now, you should probably do that. Deadlines for this reporting coming up really soon. January 2026, so about a year from now. And there's certain exemptions for small businesses. They still have to do the reporting. They just have a little extra time through July of 2026. I don't want to spend a whole lot more time on the reporting stuff because it's kind of boring, and really the only way that I could do another 2 hours just on like the TSCA reporting requirements, during which everyone would fall asleep. But these are the things that you're going to have to, in broad strokes, be reporting. The amount of the chemical itself, a description of the byproducts, really detailed specifics about the chemicals themselves that are being used, the identity of the supplier. This requires a certain amount of due diligence on the supplier of whatever material or chemical that you're receiving. So like if you're getting something from a factory in Bangladesh or China, you are going to have to do a little bit of due diligence on that so that you know what you're importing. So, litigation, lawsuits, private liability, public liability, enforcement actions by the EPA, class actions. I mean, these are serious and they're growing. And you could see in the graphic on my right side of the screen, some of the recent PFAS settlements, judgments, and verdicts for these types of cases. Typically, these arise in large groundwater exposures. So like the $10.3 billion 3M settlement, by the way, billion, not million, $10.3 billion. There's a great chance, by the way, that this lawsuit and the earplug lawsuit that 3M also got crushed on, combined are going to bankrupt 3M, for example. And 3M is a massive company, but they have to fund, I think between the two cases, like $20 billion in lawsuits. And it's a company that has a market cap of, I think, $40 billion. So these types of things can wipe you out. But these cases typically are, the really bad ones at least, are arising in the context of municipalities suing large-scale PFAS contaminators for what they did to the local water supply. So that's what 3M got dinged with pretty bad, was the manufacture and then the transportation and supplying of a million different items that they manufacture and sell, which contain PFAS, which then leaches into the groundwater, and then municipalities all around the country sued 3M for the cleanup efforts and for the costs in remediation and for trying to get that stuff out of the local drinking water. This settlement, I believe, was maybe 6 or 10 months ago. It's pretty recent, but I mean, like I said, you could see. As I was writing this presentation, I was like, this is what popped into my head, is like, why would I care about this if I am just, running my contracting company or things like that? If you're a contractor or a building contractor in particular, subcontractor, whatever, like, what does this have to do with you? Well, it does. This is, as I mentioned, PFAS are in a lot of things that we use, but Kynar and Hylar, which are like the external coatings that are used in like a huge amount of building projects, things like that, full of PFAS, as are commercial rugs. So if you're doing any demolition work and you're pulling up carpets, things like that, anything that's like a stain-resistant carpet, which is going to be full of PFAS, and that's actually a source of a lot of groundwater contamination because it sucks up the water and then it leaches out into the landfills, and it's gotten so bad. I'll show you on the next slide here, but that PFAS-enabled stain-proof carpeting is banned from a lot of public construction projects in different parts of the country now because of what happens when it eventually goes in a landfill. Lots of interior paints. You could see in that second bullet point there that basically a lot of painting that's being used in residential and commercial properties, things like that, is going to be containing PFAS as well. These things are all important because depending on where you are in the contracting hierarchy, and depending on what your contract says about your obligations to the prime or to your the folks that are upstream of you and downstream of you, you might be either liable for any contamination that may happen down the road, or you might be responsible for doing any remediation work in the event that something happens, whether it's a municipality or if it's a private lawsuit or the EPA comes along and tells you that you have to do it. So you have to make sure that you're aware of these things, and really that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, it's all accounted for in your contracts. And that's probably the step one in making sure that you're prepared for this, is taking a look at your contracts with an eye towards, okay, what happens if the work that I'm involved in results in groundwater contamination or something that needs to be cleaned up after the fact. That's also going to come into effect too is like to scheduling and the due diligence aspect of any of these new, like on a new construction project. But we could talk about that in a bit. Like I said, PFAS are like in everything. It's really hard to avoid them. Like, for example, I'm taking a sip of my PFAS manufactured water bottle containing water from here in the city of Chicago, which is known to be contaminated with PFAS, and it's just like, what can I do about it, However, there are items and there are things that can be done, and this is like a long-term project of what the EPA is trying to do, which is encourage folks away from these materials and towards ones that, do not contain PFAS, and then in the interim try to clean these things up. But so can you avoid using PFAS material and still continue to practice in the construction industry? Can you still do your work? Yes, but you have to be aware of the trade-offs. There's a couple of the sealants that I mentioned earlier, like Kynar, for example. These are the only widely available coatings that meet the AAMA, the American Architecture Manufacturers Association's 2605 standard for performance, which is a higher standard of performance in terms of like sealing and waterproofing. There are alternatives, but like I said, you're trading things off. Anodized aluminum doesn't meet the AAMA's 2605 standards, and it might be a little more expensive, like per unit, but it doesn't contain PFAS. There's also silicone modified polyesters, which are certified at AAMA 2604, not 2605. So, we're going to be creating a market for these things, especially with these regulations, that we expect manufacturers and chemical companies to meet the rising demand for non-PFAS products. I think we're already starting to see that if you pay attention to it. But as of now, you do have to understand that you can't just swap one out for another all the time. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Often, though, you're making trade-offs in costs and in performance. That said, there are some ways that you can start making those trade-offs if you want to. You can There's a couple of resources that I have up here that will point you in the right direction for swapping out construction materials or components, things like that, for non-PFAS containing alternatives. I think everyone's going to get a copy of the presentation, so you'll be able to go take a look for yourself. But the point is there are options and there are places to find it. But it is something that you're going to have to spend some time investing in. All of these things are important because of the litigation risks, as I talked about a little bit earlier. I already went through the kind of water contamination lawsuits. Those are pretty serious. But in the construction context, especially in new construction projects, owners are, of course, going to try to pass those risks downstream to their contractors, both on the design build side of things, and then kind of further down. So make sure, of course, that you are protected and that you're not taking on an unnecessary amount of risk in whatever arrangement you're negotiating. Class actions, kind of more the same, a lot of water contamination ones, although not exactly super relevant for this group, but it's still kind of interesting. There's a lot of false advertising type litigation for things that contain PFAS. Like, for example, there was a smoothie company that was selling bottled smoothies at I think at Trader Joe's, and they advertised as like quote unquote all natural, right? Well, it turns out that this smoothie contained like 800% of the allowable amounts of PFAS in it, and they got crushed on some class action truth in advertising lawsuit, and I believe were bankrupted by it. So there's other things besides just the environmental stuff here at play to keep in mind. This is going to impact construction scheduling and payments for those of you, that are on that side of things, because of the added expense and efforts needed for the due diligence kind of portions of this. Whether it's a real estate transaction or, like I said, new construction. So we expect to see, like, at least in the early part until folks figure this out, acceleration claims, delay claims, things like that. One kind of silver lining is, unlike asbestos, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of employee claims for exposure to PFAS. Like, there have been, and there still are, but really since the 1980s, asbestos lawsuits from employees that worked in factories that are claiming they were exposed to asbestos, and then later developed either mesothelioma or lung cancer, things like that down the road from asbestos exposure. And those lawsuits are still going on from folks that worked in these factories in like the 80s. That was like many, many billions of dollars were spent in those lawsuits. Probably not going to have that with PFAS because it's everywhere. So you can't like blame it on working at one given factory, or you can't, tie it up to like something that happened in the workplace because, as I mentioned, we all are chock full of PFAS already. So it's you're not going to be able to blame it on an employer in that situation. Both at the federal and state level, regulators, and I'm not going to spend much time on state level regulations today, but you should be aware that there's a ton of them, and they're the likely suspects. So obviously California, but Minnesota, big one, Illinois, but I mean, really, it's not so much just the states that you would expect for like to be hyper aware of environmental concerns. It's probably going to end up being pretty close to 50 states that have regulations on this stuff. But these are going to impose various due diligence and cleanup responsibilities on folks that are involved in real estate and corporate transactions. And the states and the federal government have made clear that by way of the EPA enforcement actions that have already happened, that they will go after landowners and land developers in the event that they don't necessarily introduce PFAS to the land, but they cause its spread, for example. So, even though it may not be your materials that are brought onto a project that contain PFAS, if your activity is what causes them to leach into the groundwater, for example, you can be either facing a direct action from the EPA or tied up in litigation to fund the remediation aspect of it all. And of course, construction delays and things like that. EPA has already categorized most industrial PFAS as hazardous substances under SURLA, which means that they can sue to force cleanup, or they can perform the cleanup themselves and then seek to recoup what EPA spends on the cleanup efforts through the private companies that were responsible. We're also seeing this show up more on the permitting side of things, state and local levels, making sure that discharge limits for both air and wastewater are within certain threshold levels. This is, again, local and state efforts to control, the amount of wastewater that's getting into the drinking supply. I was trying to think of something that would be a really good example of what this looks like, because everything I've talked about so far has mostly been pretty high level. And this, for a lot of folks, this is going to be an introduction to PFAS, and maybe you never really heard about it or thought about it before. But I wanted to give a couple of examples of how this could affect maybe your local day-to-day work. And I read a lot about what's happening in demolition work, for example. Textiles and carpets and things like that. Those are big risks for runoff into groundwater, as I mentioned. There was a massive lawsuit in Georgia, which was for a carpet manufacturer that was manufacturing this stain-proof carpeting. The wastewater that it was generating in that process was then going into chemical cleaning facilities, and it turns out those facilities weren't scrubbing the PFAS out, and it was contaminating the rest of the water that was in there. So it was spreading it even worse. This stuff ended up in local rivers all over Georgia, massive lawsuits, Clean Water Act violations, EPA action, etc. We talked about the thing that you could be worrying about now, which is, what does your contract say about these types of things? Downstream violations are being passed from owners to contractors, indemnification obligations of a subcontractor to a general contractor, things like that. You should also know that most commercial general liability policies, most insurance that you're going to be purchasing and maintaining as a construction company, or really any kind of company, has already written out PFAS, and it will not cover casualty events related to PFAS. It's written out the exact same way that mold exposure is, or things like that. So if you're worried about it and you're thinking, well, at least I have insurance, you probably don't. And it's the insurance companies, when they flag something like that and they write it out of their new policies, and they started doing this 5 or 10 years ago, it's like Vegas. They just, you're not going to beat them. They're right 99% of the time. So that shows you what they expect to be coming down the pipeline, which is a lot of uninsured risk. Lastly, some things that you're going to start to see, I think, more common are industry groups, private organizations that won't certify certain projects or materials or things like that if different PFAS thresholds aren't met. Green Seal certified paints, for example, cannot contain PFAS. The Green Health and Healthy Hospitals also won't certify those types of materials if they're in new hospital projects, if they contain PFAS, things like that you can see here at the bottom. So if your contract, for example, or your development, or your permit, or whatever deal it is that you're making with the local municipality is going to require certain types of certifications for the new construction, like environmental certifications, things like that, be aware that you may not be able to get those certifications unless you are taking certain steps with respect to PFAS in the project. And the last thing, obviously, is, what can I do and what can I talk to a lawyer about, things like that. We have clients that come to us on this type of thing, and we're expecting to see a lot more, frankly, to do risk assessments of cleanup risks, and you can also ballpark, what that looks like and the likelihood of it happening, and also what it might cost, things like that. Obviously, litigation defense, including PFAS risks in building that into the due diligence process for M&A and real estate transactions. If any of you folks are in California, there's Prop 65, which deals with this, and there's a little more different risk exposure and things like that, which I have here as well. And dealing with kind of generally the potential for public outrage if and when something happens. What does that look like in practice? For the most part, it's going to at least start with really taking a different look at how contracts, both in the construction perspective, but also supply chain, things like that, are written and negotiated, and making sure that everyone is not exposing themselves to huge risks for something that's probably uninsured. This is also going to include the reporting requirements, making sure that your company is in compliance with the EPA regulations and things of that sort. So you'll see in the last slide here, which I'll kind of skip over for now. There's a couple more items here, but the long and short of it is, what should people that are worried about this be doing right now? I would start with, one, taking a really hard look at the materials that you're working with and around, and trying to do your best to figure out whether they do contain PFAS, and secondary to that, what does your contract have to say about risk in the event that something goes wrong? Everything else down the road from that, like new construction, due diligence, things like that. I mean, yes, on the next new construction project that you're working on, you should certainly take a different tact and be accounting for PFAS associated risks. But I would start with anything that you have ongoing. The next contract you sign, for example, you should be considering some of the things I talked about today. So, last thing I'll mention, I've been told I have a face for radio, so if you don't mind listening to my voice, you can check out the firm podcast, which is called Litigation Nation, which I do. It's bi-weekly. Find that on Apple, Spotify podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We talk about things like PFAS, but also some of the larger lawsuits in the country and developments oftentimes in the construction industry. So, all right. Thanks, everyone.